All right, I think we can start. I'm sure more people will trickle in as we're beginning, but I don't want to hold Rainbow Railroad longer for them we asked them for. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're calling in. My name is Sam Ritholtz. I am a DPhil student here in the Refugee Studies Centre, and welcome to our event with Rainbow Railroad, Devin Matthews of Rainbow Railroad, in celebration of LGBTQ History Month. This is our second year running an LGBTQIQ plus History Month event at the Refugee Studies Centre. Obviously, the study of forcibly displaced populations around the world includes people who are displaced based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And so for all of us at the center, we felt it was really important to think through some of the incredible work that's being done both by scholars and organizations in this space. Last year, we had a wonderful discussion that was a mix of quote unquote practitioners and scholars. And this year we'll be having a conversation with the director of programs of one of the most prominent LGBT refugee rights organizations. So just some beginning housekeeping before we start this event. This event will be Devin and I will have a conversation for about 30 minutes. And then starting around 6 o'clock UK time, we'll do an open Q&A with the audience. At the bottom of this event, you can see there's a Q&A button. And that's where we ask that you put in your questions, and I will ask the questions. You can put in your questions at any time during the presentation, so you don't have to wait until we're at the Q&A time. So if a question pops up while one of us is speaking, please just send it as you wish. And with that said, the first half of this conversation will be recorded. So the conversation between me and Devin will be recorded. But then once we get to the Q&A where I start asking your questions, I will not record. And when you're asking your questions, if you wish to ask your question anonymously, do let me know when you're typing in the Q&A box. You can just type the question and then in parentheses put anonymous. So with that said, to introduce, I'm introducing Devin Matthews, who is our speaker today. Devin comes to Rainbow Railroad with most recent experience, or Devin, I should say, is the director of programs at Rainbow Railroad. Rainbow Railroad is an organization that helps LGBTQI plus people escape state-sponsored violence. As they say on their website, in countries around the world, LGBTQI plus people face violence and oppression simply because of who they are, who they love, or who they are. Rainbow Railroad helps get them to safety. And since January 1st, 2022, so about almost 2 months ago, in the past 2 months, they've received 1,051 requests for help. So just in 2 months, that's how many requests they've received. And then Devin is the director of programs at Rainbow Railroad. She uses she, her pronouns. Devin comes to Rainbow Railroad with most recent experience as the manager of fellowship programs at Engineers Without Borders Canada, where her work involved the strategic oversight and execution of 4 programs based in sub-Saharan Africa. Devin brings with her years of experience in facilitation, activism, coaching, immigrant services, participatory research, and nonprofit funding. Devin holds numerous professional certifications in project management, social systems leadership, and professional coaching. She also holds a BA in honors from Dalhousie University, I hope I pronounced that right, where she specialized in international development. When not at Rainbow Railroad, Devin can be found writing, reading, organizing, and consulting in Toronto and abroad. So with that, I'm now going to hand this over to Devin, who you can correct anything I've just said, add any more context or introductory material, and also begin to present the work of Rainbow Railroad, the amazing work, I should say.
Thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate it. Good to be here today. Thank you for coming, everybody. It's really important to chat about, the refugee and forcibly displaced population when we talk about LGBTQI history, as it's a group of individuals that are really frequently left out of the broader kind of sectoral dialogue on queer and trans rights. And so really grateful, Sam, for your kind of leadership in organizing this and bringing this together. It's really exciting. And I have nothing really to add to my bio other than that I've been with the organization now for just under 4 years. It's been quite the ride. When I started, we were quite a small organization that was doing in terms of, we mentioned at the top, the request for help number that we've already received this year. That number was almost the annual number of requests for help that we received when I started with the organization. And we've just year on year received, every year we've gone up by the thousands in terms of the need that we need to respond to since I started with the organization. And so now we've really grown into a position of leadership within the international space and supporting LGBTQI refugees. I'm really excited to chat today a little bit about the work that we've done as it relates to the broader movement and how important it is to be considering LGBTQI refugees, migrants, forcibly displaced people as a broader part of the kind of like conversation and dialogue on LGBTQI rights. I mean, I think this is probably incredibly resonant right now, given everything that's been going on, be it in Afghanistan or in the Ukraine most recently. And we have been responding to not only these major international kind of political crises that affect everybody, but queer folks within that community. But also we have seen over the course of the last few years, COVID-19 rage through countries where LGBTQI individuals and immune compromised HIV positive individuals have been kind of at the front of discrimination and economic scarcity and scapegoating by governments and institutions. We've seen, localized crackdowns and legislation, from Texas to Ghana to Nigeria to Russia. So, consistently we're showing up and seeing how while there may be some really significant progress being made in the realm of LGBTQI rights, in comparison, obviously, with the historical legacy that we all know, there has been some really concerning shifts and trends within the refugee, asylee, and migrant space that Rainbow Railroad seeks to address, bring light to, and also continue to, work on instrumentally within the community. I guess before I dive in, I'll just say I'm very much a practitioner of this space and not an academic of this space. And so I'm really excited to have a dialogue around kind of like some of the more academic aspects of this work. And what I'm about to present to you in short form, I'm just going to quickly overview it, is a culmination of really practical data and research that we've done as an organization that really works at the front lines of this crisis and of this rights work. It's not principally meant to be a data heavy academic document or something that's incredibly peer reviewed or something like that. But what it is meant to be is a real flagship document within the space of practitioners who are doing this work with LGBTQI refugees and migrants. There is very, very little. Anyone who's probably doing research in this space understands the absolute lack of reliable or organizationally collected information on refugees and migrants that are LGBTQI. We know that massive institutions like the UNHCR and the IOM and others, consistently lack data that is publicly accessible and useful in driving research and solutions forward for the LGBTQI refugee community. And so we really aimed to just take something practical that we work with every single day and turn it into a publicly usable, database of information so that researchers and practitioners and activists globally can use it and hopefully advance the work that they're doing as well. So with that, I guess I will just quickly, is everyone seeing this report okay? Yeah, okay, great. Perfect. So maybe I'll just quickly flip to the title screen and then go back. So this is our 2020 annual report, but it does take a very different, and the reason I'm saying 2020 is because, it reported back on 2020. We published it last year. And, unlike a lot of typical like nonprofit annual reports, obviously this includes financial data and donor recognition, but it really aims to bring light to the real numbers behind the crisis that we're dealing with and the people that we work with. And so this is accessible on our website, and you're able to kind of dig into this and look at this after I present, but I wanted to just kind of give a high level overview of what we have worked on. So this is a map of kind of, some of the major hotspots of where we've been working over the course of the last number of years. We receive, a significant number of requests from Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, South Central Asia, Eastern Europe. And then Jamaica and the Caribbean is a huge area of work for us in relation to, LGBTQI state-sponsored and state-enabled violence. And then additionally within Latin America around the Northern Triangle, and the Venezuelan kind of migrant crisis and the kind of chokehold at the border between Mexico and the US. So this is a very high level snapshot. We are really kind of consistently fighting against the difference between, or like existing within this tension point between state-sponsored and state-enabled, community-driven violence and persecution. And these aren't really super clear systems. It's not like, there are only X number of countries that have the death penalty, for example, and yet we see community vigilante, hate crimes and death threats happening all the time in countries that have theoretically some legal protection. And so we're really trying to figure out how to, stay aware of the changes and nuance in each country that we respond to, and how the kind of cultural shifts, militarization, movement within government, et cetera, is happening.
I'm sorry, Devin, just to clarify that. So with Rainbow Railroad is Canadian based, that's correct? But
we are actually a 501c3 in the US as well. And so we're a Canadian registered organization, and we actually have an American registration as well. And I'm kind of a desk office in New York. And then do work in about almost 40 countries now.
And then when you're trying to, when you're talking about that previous slot or pages, with these countries, these are where people are coming from, and you're not necessarily just bringing them to Canada and United States, you're bringing them anywhere they can find safety. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have a suite of programs that support, and I'm going to get a little bit into this in a moment, but we have a suite of programs that offer different options to different individuals based on their unique circumstances. And so one, like our flagship bread and butter program that most people would know about us, is that we're moving people from a position of risk and danger within their home country to a place where they can seek formal asylum and protection, typically in Europe and North America. But we also have a suite of other programs that offer, temporary refuge for human rights defenders, response to emergent crackdowns, domestic relocation for people who just might need to move from like a rural environment to an urban environment in a country that has quasi protections, such as India. So lots of different contextual kind of like program offerings depending on the person's unique circumstances and positionality, and also asks, like, I think a really important thing as I move through chatting with everyone today is just to note that Rainbow Railroad's core philosophy around working with individuals is that they are the guide and leaders of their own journey, and we act merely as facilitators of the process and support them in what solutions kind of make the most sense for them in their lives at that moment. Even sometimes if those solutions are not necessarily the most long-term or durable, if they feel good in that moment for the individual to be able to, live the life that they need, then we will do our best to support in that. So I'm gonna briefly skip over kind of this piece here around COVID, because I could get into like a 7-hour long conversation about it, as I'm sure we all could. We have a report available on our website that looks at the impact of COVID-19 and how it has impacted the LGBTQI refugee community or displaced community. I mean, the cliff notes are it's been wreckage globally, and lots of the unique circumstances that the individuals that we're working with deal with as a result of the pandemic, and some really interesting anecdotes that I think I hadn't anticipated prior to the pandemic, of the ways in which state, like the relationship between state violence against the LGBTQI community and the pandemic intersect, especially as it relates to religion and lore. I guess we've seen a lot of queer and trans individuals being blamed for the pandemic, and for the ways in which people's views on illness and the spread of illness it's been quite fascinating. So I encourage you to check that out, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A about specifically COVID, but I don't want to get too deep into that. I'm going to just quickly note that these numbers are our requests for help from 2020. So it gives a little snapshot of how intensely different the climate is now in comparison with a few years ago. So in 2020, we had a total of 2,773 requests for help, from a total of 3,451 individuals. So when someone requests help, they may be requesting, like, their case might be for a family, or them and their partner, or them, their partner, and their child. And so we had 2,773 cases in 2020. For context, we are projecting eclipsing 10,000 this year. It's been just a remarkable just shift in not only, I think, how intense the world is and the climate globally is right now for LGBTQI individuals, but also it's a testament also to kind of our brand recognition and how people are seeing us as an organization, and how we're kind of moving through the space. I will say this year, about 42% of our requests for help have come from Afghanistan. And so that previous to the Taliban, the fall to the Taliban that happened last year, we received on average about 50 requests for help from Afghanistan per year. And already this year, we're seeing about 41% of our total requests for help coming from the country. So clearly a crisis, and totally taking over some of our numbers. But outside of that, you can see the growth trajectory that we're seeing in the request for help and the need to respond to this crisis. Then if we just move forward here, this is going to be kind of difficult for you to probably dig into in depth. And so I'm showing you this as kind of a preview to hopefully encourage you to check it out in more detail on our website, so that you can kind of dig into some of this data. But if you look here at the safety concerns that we are dealing with, so when we do casework, when we're doing intake with an individual and we're looking at their unique circumstances and what they're going through, the person is assigned a caseworker that guides them through their journey and determines what program suits them best and what offerings we can do to support them. When that caseworker is assigned to their file, we are doing a risk assessment in two kind of different categories. One is around safety concerns, and one is around health and welfare concerns. And these assessments have kind of gleaned this data. So when you're looking at these numbers, this is from like one-to-one interaction between caseworker and case individual that's happening over the course of emails, WhatsApp messages, interviews, et cetera, that happen throughout the casework process. The top 5 most reported safety concerns in 2020 are listed here. The categories below are kind of the breadth. I call it like the sad list. It's like in our system, it's just a very depressing checkbox process of how people are moving through persecution. But as you'll see, the top kind of 5 areas of safety concerns relate to family-based rejection, violence, sexual violence, physical violence, and being in hiding due to credible threat. We also see large numbers of reports of police brutality, public outing, blackmailing, religious-based persecution, denial of medical care, marriage under duress, conversion therapy, etc. And so you can kind of see the data laid out here by both by region and by gender identity. And the trends are quite interesting when you look at the ways in which trans folks, for example, move through the world and how they experience violence. As an example, we see trans and non-binary and genderqueer individuals experiencing a higher rate of sexual violence and violence as a result of being involved in sex work, either electively or forcibly. When we look at regional trends, we see a high number of like a specific types of attacks based on the region, right? So we see a lot of date baiting, for example, in the MENA region, where governments or police forces are setting up fake Grindr profiles or fake dating app profiles and baiting people into dates, at which point they're arrested or interrogated or outed to their family members afterwards. And then, for example, in the Caribbean, we see examples of things like arson and public violence as being more common versus in other regions of the world. And so it's really helpful for us when we're designing our programming based on region to look at what the most common sources of violence and persecution are. A really common thing for folks to ask us is how we kind of, LGBTQI individuals globally, regardless of whether you're in Canada, Thailand, or Australia, wherever, experience instances of family-based violence and rejection kind of, very commonly, and it's not necessarily tied to the need for refuge or like state-based persecution. I will just say that when we look at it in relation to our client base, it's typically like things like someone being date baited and interrogated by the police, and the police threatening that if they don't come out to their family or they don't share information with their family, then they'll be a victim of a repeat attack, or people being turned over to their family, or people being held forcibly in their families' homes and subjected to forced marriage because of public shaming and things like this. And so it differs like really dramatically in like the home-based context in the countries that we work in versus kind of in a context like Canada or the United States or the UK. So really encourage you to kind of deep dive into this data if you find it interesting. I'm like, this is the first time we've ever released data like this. We're going to be releasing more as our system kind of allows and grows. But, currently we're sitting on thousands and thousands and thousands of life histories of queer and trans people globally experiencing persecution, which is kind of a intense responsibility for us to kind of really take this and bring it to the public, given the lack of information globally available.
And on that note, just out of curiosity, this is really interesting stuff. Horrific, but interesting. Is that data available anonymized for academics?
Yes.
Or could it be?
Yeah, so we don't have it like listed or on our website, but we do have the data, like the raw anonymized data that we can share. It might take us a bit, so please don't email us asking us to give it to you in 24 hours, but we can certainly talk about it, and you can email us and we can try to figure out how to make that the most useful for you. We want people to be able to use it and work with it. And I would say increasingly, because this data is still very relevant, but a little bit older. I think like as you see our data coming out in the coming, like we're going to be releasing another report this year with updated data. And our hope is to continue to release this information and really like improve the way that we communicate it. And so, yeah, if at any point it's interesting or useful, please reach out.
Well, there's probably quite a few refugee and forced migration studies master's students in the audience right now. And if any of them are considering a thesis, this is a data goldmine. I mean, this data doesn't exist anywhere, and it's so ripe for analysis in so many different directions. And it's an amazing resource. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, not at all.
I'm excited. I'm thinking, ooh, theses.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the last page was on safety concerns. This one's on health and welfare concerns. These are the top ones that we're working with. Typically a lack of basic needs, risk of suicide, income loss due to COVID-19, homelessness, and folks that are HIV positive and suffering with the lack of access to medication, testing, et cetera. I'll just quickly touch on the risk of suicide piece, because it's such an inhibitor in some ways to the way that we move through our work. Mental health is, such a huge, every single person basically that we work with is suffering from some form of PTSD or depression, anxiety, or panic disorder, or, other various mental health concerns. And, as you can see here, nearly 20% of our clients actively report experiencing suicidality. And as we know about the data around suicide, a lot of people don't talk about it until it gets to a very dangerous point. And so if 20% of the people that we work with are talking and disclosing it electively, like on a regular basis, that's a really scary percentage, given that there's probably an additional 15 to 20% at a minimum that are thinking about it and not talking about it, right? So it's been a massive concern of ours, and we're taking time over the course of this year to double down and invest in our psychosocial support within our programming, so that people throughout the journey can be as protected as possible. But it's just a really sad situation when we look at the landscape of persecution, and something that a lot of people don't think about or talk about in the refugee landscape, that it's not just external factors that are a risk to life and security. It's also the cumulative effect of being constantly alienated, isolated, and on the run and in survival mode, that leads us to lose people, is an internal struggle as a result of all of these external factors, and not something that's typically that like mainstream institutions really want to deal with, right? Like there was a really public case of an LGBTQI refugee from Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, who unfortunately took his own life in front of the UNHCR office in Nairobi a number of years ago, as a statement around the lack of services and access to support. And those types of cases are real examples of how much we need to talk about mental health in this landscape and really support people through their journeys. And so that's a huge part of what we do peer-to-peer as well.
And sorry, this is,
yeah,
excuse me for being crass, but was it an LGBT refugee or just a,
yeah.
There's for students thinking about this topic, which is really important and obviously quite difficult. There's a beautiful piece by Seema Shaksari, I think it's called Killing Me Softly with Your Rights, where she talks about the death of a trans woman in Canada named Makhtab, who, a trans refugee in Canada named Makhtab, who after losing her housing, I guess refugees in Canada get housing for a year, or at least they did at the time that she was writing. I think this was about 6 years ago. It took her own life as a result of losing resources. And so it's an obligation that not only extends to the provision of aid in crisis conditions like refugee camps, but also in states of quote unquote sanctuary or asylum. And thank you for flagging that.
Yeah, so this is just kind of a high level summary of some of the pieces that we have, I just kind of ran through, but I'll just bring attention to a couple of different things. Really, I think two things that really come to mind in this moment that we're in globally right now are, and we're already seeing it. I'm sure that there's going to be some questions around the Ukraine, but we're already seeing this emerging in the context of the crisis that's unfolding as we all watch with bated breath for what's going to be happening in what is, trending to be potentially one of the largest migrant crises that we have faced in some time. But women, specifically trans women and genderqueer individuals, are facing absolute, like, over the top barriers to accessing the typical systems of the UNHCR and the IOM and like other major refugee serving organizations, and in accessing formal resettlement programs, right? So the Canadian government, for example, has a really strong refugee resettlement program, but the individual is required to flee their home country and become a refugee in order to access those services. And for most of our trans and non-binary and genderqueer clients, physically leaving the country, especially when they present as quote unquote different from their ID documentation, is next to impossible. And we see this when we're working through it, we really just recognize that like the point of our organization in part is to act as this peer-to-peer support for people who the formal refugee process fails. And typically that's trans, non-binary, and genderqueer people. I'm not saying that, lesbian, bisexual, and gay, cis gay men don't face barriers. They absolutely do. But we just know that the barriers are so much more intense for trans, non-binary, and genderqueer folks. And then again, as a kind of moment globally right now, we, in the wake of kind of the race, like Black rights movement that has happened in the US and is continuing to move through, globally around dialogue and discussion around police brutality and military violence. We see the reverberations of police and paramilitary, violence against the LGBTQI community everywhere, and anti-Black racism as it relates to airports, security, infrastructure, and like xenophobic screening by various governments in North America and Europe. And so it's just such a like the data really proves what some of these international conversations around rights as it relates to LGBTQI people are happening globally. I think I will probably end there. Maybe I'll just quit so that we can like chat a little bit more, Sam, because I've gone on a bit now, but just to say quickly, like look through, if you're keen on data and you are working on something in this research area, I would click through some of these major pieces. This is kind of more just typical annual report stuff. But I would really encourage you to kind of look at some of the data and see if there's anything that, merits kind of further dialogue or digging into. We're really excited to keep bringing this information to light and attempting to tell the story of our clients through data and through narrative, kind of ongoing, because I find it fascinating. Obviously I'm biased, but I think it's really, as someone who's been involved in the LGBTQI movement in various degrees far before my time at Rainbow Railroad, this type of information is rare. And so trying to help kind of bring this to light is a huge part of what we do. So I'll pause there.